Okay. There's a big question from Ustad Sanal, dear brother from the UK, mashallah. I'm going to hold that question. That's a big question. So Professor Abdullah and Dr. Matthews may think about that one. Let's do a warm-up one to get to that big one. Uh, Zana said, Professor Abdullah said something wonderful, to blend modernity between sacred and secular. Uh, our guests asked, what are three examples to bridge the sacred and secular?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that. I think the first thing we should do is do away with these labels, sacred and secular. We don't have those labels. They are an imposition upon our tradition. And remember that Muslim scholars who were who were exposed, not just exposed, who came in contact with and engaged with the knowledge of the ancient civilizations, such as the Greeks and the Persians and the Indians, they call them ulum al-awail, the knowledge of the ancients. And so the scholars divided knowledge into fard ayn and fard kifaya, individually compulsory and a communal obligation, and also into ilm nafi' and ilm dar, beneficial knowledge and harmful knowledge. And so they never had this dichotomy of sacred and secular, and therefore instead of having two big circles of knowledge, they had one big circle called knowledge, and the intent and the application of that knowledge made it beneficial or otherwise. So you'd, for example, you would find somebody like the Ibn Nafis, the physician who discovered the blood circulation system, was at once a brilliant physician, but also a Shafi'i jurist and a hafiz of the Quran, right? So they didn't have that dichotomy. So some examples that can bridge that secular sacred and secular, so to speak. Take the example of science, for example. The very philosophy of science, in a secular sense, is about taking full advantage of this earth without recognizing the inherent responsibility and stewardship that we have towards it. And so, from an Islamic perspective, you would engage students in this type of science by first inculcating in them, which is part of the fitrah, this idea of being just towards Mother Nature or Earth, and that any type of science that we undergo is not just simply for the pillaging of the earth and taking control over this earth, but rather fulfillment of a trust. And this can completely reshape the way we look at science, for example. And that's what Muslims have done in the past. But also in terms of the secular understanding, again, quote unquote, secular understanding of the question of governance or governance and government today. We can bridge that gap by looking at the Islamic understanding of governance and governance from a sacred perspective, and to give it a completely different spin, where governance and government, in this case, becomes also a sense of responsibility, not a privilege, but a responsibility. And that completely redirects the way we see the focus of leadership, of governing and to be governed. Just very quickly, because of time, these are some ways perhaps we can look at that.
MashaAllah, excellent. And from those, we could think of the work that is occurring in Islamic schools. For example, sacred activism is a very
Yeah.
interesting term. We talk about service programs, we talk about civic engagement, but if it's to bridge that connected, but the intention needs to be as a sacred practice, and there are certain principles to uphold in activism. Uh,
Yeah.
as a further example,
And
but
I can't emphasize enough the idea that the mind shift, we have to create a mind
yeah,
shift in our students, that this idea of sacred and secular is actually problematic for us. And we need to move away from that.
beautifully said. Which is arguably one of the intentions of the stimulus paper, to operate within our own worldview, within
Yeah.
our own philosophy. So there isn't that dichotomy, that lens, as Dr. Matthews was talking about, is applied to everything, that's policies, practices, everything that's going on. That's an excellent question. Dr. Matthews, another one here, which picks up on something that you mentioned. Uh, how would you modify your programs working backwards from the graduate qualities? Could you please give an example?
Yep, so we started that process last year. Once we finalized the graduate qualities, we encouraged our educators in the process of them reviewing their programs to look at the unit of work and also compare it to the list of graduate qualities and draw out which graduate qualities would align with that unit of work. And then actually in the program, when they are rewriting that program, we also do this with the learning intention. When we write the learning intention, what is the niyyah of that unit of work and what higher purpose is that going to serve? So they need to write that even before they get to the graduate qualities. But then they will write the graduate quality. For example, we had a presentation yesterday by a biology teacher, and she was talking about red blood cells and its carrying capacity of oxygen. So the graduate quality that she drew out from that was God consciousness. And related to that is the creative design, rather than arbitrary design of the human body and the intricacies and amazing complexity of the human body. And she actually gave she mentioned the feedback she got from CITE on the observation of that particular lesson. She then went and reworked that to make deeper connections with the Islamic worldview and relate it to sickness and health. So what happens when the red blood cell itself is not functioning as it should, with sickle cells, for example. So I think this is a process that we are still engaging with. It's going to get better, inshallah. We're at the beginning of it. So we put the graduate qualities in the program. We also started putting graduate qualities in our report cards, in our reporting system, or at the end of that particular unit. One of the things that we've recognized is to make we've got a list of 22 graduate qualities, but to make them age appropriate, we may have to scaffold them from K to 12 and not do all 22 in kindergarten, for example, but decide which of those 22 graduate qualities we'd like to focus in stage 1, which are we going to, and so forth, until we get to stage 6, inshallah. So that's another project we're going to work on.
MashaAllah, that's profound. And, hearing from Dr. Matthews, that means that in an era where curriculum is king, curriculum, an Australian curriculum or any other curriculum, is absent of meta purpose, doesn't have it. So without the effort that Dr. Matthews just explained of putting that up front, then we'll only be driven by curriculum outcomes or curriculum standards. Putting those graduate qualities up front is deeply transformative, mashallah, amazing, very, very practical. One final question in the time that we have, from Ustad Sanal, a dear brother of ours. We met at Cambridge University only last year. I'll open to both of you. It's an open question, and this is the final question. Maybe a brief comment, just because of time. How can an understanding of the Islamic notion of fitrah help us to introduce a values-based education into our schools?
Would Dr. Zakaria would like to perhaps go
No,
first?
I think you go first, Prof.
Yeah, well, again, very briefly. So here are some ways in which perhaps understanding fitrah can help introduce value-based education in schools. For example, number one, the fitrah, as we have said, underpins the belief that all humans are born with an innate understanding of good and evil, a natural inclination towards truth, justice, and morality. So by framing education around these universal values, schools can create curricula that appeal to these inherent understandings, so potentially leading to a more intuitive and deeply felt learning experience for students. That's one example. Or secondly, one can think of ethical reasoning and moral education. Fitrah-based education can enhance ethical reasoning by encouraging students to connect their learning with their innate moral senses or fitrah. This, for example, can be achieved through case studies, storytelling, discussion on moral dilemmas, integrating ethical questions into all subjects, not just religious Islamic subjects. And these type of practices can help students apply their innate understanding of morality to real-world situations. Perhaps one more, I could mention here quickly, this idea of resilience and inner strength that comes to mind. So teaching students about the concept of fitrah can help them understand and cultivate that inner strength and resilience. This is value-based by reinforcing that they have an inherent capacity to overcome challenges and say make morally sound decisions, education can empower those students to navigate life's challenges more effectively. Just very briefly and quickly.
I think the only thing that I would add to that is the whole concept of values education takes me back to the era of John Howard.
Yes.
And the values education that he drove back then. So I think it's important for us to start out with the Islamic worldview and how do we define values, and from an Islamic perspective, what are the values that are important for our learners and how that connects to their fitrah. I think that's the tension. And we shouldn't be scared of that, because if our starting point is the Islamic worldview, which is anchored in the tradition of Islam, we will be able to navigate those things. And there are going to be some similarities, but there are going to be some things, some values that are not going to be in alignment with an Islamic worldview. And it's important for us to recognize that. But again, as I emphasized before, the starting point should be the Islamic worldview. And that's something that we need to learn. We need to learn what is the Islamic worldview when it comes to Islamic education.
MashaAllah, excellent responses. Just to wrap up on that, I guess an open question. Do we believe that secular, humanistic, Western values can help advance the distinct aspiration and end goals of Islamic schooling? And that's another way of flipping that question. What we heard from both our guest and expert presenters is that when you begin from that worldview, you are engaging in something that is grounded, often in perhaps previous phase where we were, collectively, there was an effort to graft Islamic things on. So to begin with secular, humanistic, universal values, which we would all agree with, such as respect, tolerance, which is an underwhelming value, but it's still a secular, humanistic value, and then lightly graft certain Islamic ones. Dr. Matthews, however, has explained powerfully about the distinction between grafting something on and grounding. And any values-based education, as he explained beautifully, that is grounded would be the basis for an appropriate educational program in an Islamic school, mashallah. Ladies and gentlemen, honoured guests, jazakallah khair to our expert presenters. Thank you so much for your time and the gems that you shared. It is humbling to see so many participants from all over the world, all with a stake in Islamic schooling, locally, regionally, and globally. We hope that you enjoyed this first webinar in a series to come monthly webinars. We hope that we've encouraged you to begin this journey with and within the inaugural stimulus paper 1.0, a shared vision for Islamic schooling in Australia, learners, learning, and leading learning. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.